The dust kicked up by the morning wind carried secrets through the town of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1887. Sheriff Marcus Whitfield adjusted his worn leather holster as he walked down the main street, his boots echoing against the wooden planks that lined the storefronts. The town had been quiet for weeks, almost too quiet for a place that sat directly on the old cattle trail from Texas to California. But that morning, everything was about to change when a stagecoach rolled into town carrying a woman who would turn his world upside down. The woman stepped down from the dusty coach with the grace of someone accustomed to finer things than what Copper Ridge had to offer. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a modest traveling hat, and her dress, though practical for the journey, spoke of quality and careful tailoring. She carried herself with a confidence that made heads turn as she walked toward the hotel, but there was something in her eyes that Marcus noticed immediately. Fear. She was running from something or someone. Marcus had seen enough people pass through Copper Ridge to recognize the signs. Some came seeking fortune in the silver mines that dotted the nearby hills. Others were simply passing through on their way to California. But this woman was different. She carried herself like someone with a purpose, yet that underlying fear suggested her presence in their small town wasn't entirely by choice. The stranger registered at the hotel under the name Catherine Morgan, paying for a week in advance with crisp bills that looked fresh from a bank vault. Old Pete behind the hotel desk later told Marcus that she'd asked specifically about the town's telegraph office and whether there were any regular mail deliveries. These weren't the questions of a casual traveler, but of someone expecting either important news or dreading it. That first evening, Catherine appeared in the hotel's dining room for supper. The conversation in the room dropped to hushed whispers as she entered. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, a beautiful stranger was bound to cause a stir. But Marcus noticed something else as he watched from his usual table in the corner. The way she positioned herself with her back to the wall, how her eyes constantly scanned the room, the way her hand never strayed far from her small traveling bag. These were the habits of someone who had learned to be cautious, someone who had reason to fear unexpected visitors. Marcus had been sheriff of Copper Ridge for 5 years, ever since the previous lawman had been gunned down by cattle rustlers. He'd learned to read people quickly in this job, and Catherine Morgan was a puzzle that intrigued him more than it should have. When she asked him the next morning about hiring protection for a journey further west, he found himself volunteering for the job before she'd even finished explaining what she needed. Catherine explained that she needed to reach Carson City, Nevada, where she was expected to meet her intended husband, a man named William Hartwell who owned mining interests in the area. It was an arranged marriage, she said, set up through correspondence by their families back east. But the way she said it, the slight hesitation in her voice, made Marcus suspect there was more to the story than a simple arranged marriage. The journey to Carson City would normally take about a week on horseback, traveling through some of the most unforgiving territory in the Arizona and Nevada deserts. It wasn't a trip for the unprepared, and certainly not one for a woman traveling alone. Marcus agreed to escort her, though he couldn't quite explain to himself why he was so eager to help a woman he'd just met. They set out 3 days later, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the eastern mountains. Catherine had purchased practical traveling clothes and a reliable horse, showing that despite her obvious eastern upbringing, she understood the realities of desert travel. As they rode out of Copper Ridge, Marcus caught several of the townspeople watching from their windows and doorways. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by now everyone knew about the mysterious woman and her arrangement with their sheriff. The first day of travel passed peacefully enough. Catherine proved to be a competent rider, keeping pace with Marcus without complaint despite the heat and the rough terrain. They made camp that evening near a small creek that provided fresh water for themselves and their horses. It was then, as they sat by their campfire under a sky full of stars, that Catherine began to reveal more about her true situation. Her real name, she admitted, was Catherine Brennan, and she was indeed traveling to meet a man she was supposed to marry. But William Hartwell wasn't her chosen husband. He was a man her father had selected to settle gambling debts that had nearly destroyed their family's reputation back in Philadelphia. The marriage was essentially a business transaction, her hand in exchange for her father's financial obligations. But there was more to her story, something she seemed reluctant to share even as she opened up about her circumstances. Marcus didn't push for details, sensing that whatever secrets she carried were painful ones. Instead, he told her about his own journey to Copper Ridge, how he'd left behind a life in Colorado after losing his wife and child to scarlet fever. They were both, in their own ways, running from the past. The second day brought the first sign of real trouble. Marcus spotted dust clouds on their back trail, the telltale sign of riders following them at a distance. When he mentioned it to Catherine, the fear he'd noticed in her eyes back in Copper Ridge returned with full force. She urged him to push their horses harder, to put more distance between them and whoever might be following. But she still wouldn't explain who she thought might be pursuing them. That evening, as they made camp in the shelter of some large rocks, Marcus finally pressed her for the truth. What he learned changed everything he thought he knew about Catherine Brennan and her journey west. She wasn't just fleeing an arranged marriage. She was running from a murder charge back in Philadelphia. According to Catherine, she'd been accused of poisoning her father's business partner, a man named Theodore Ashford who had been pushing for the marriage arrangement with William Hartwell. Ashford had died suddenly after a business dinner at the Brennan house, and Catherine had been the prime suspect when authorities discovered that she'd purchased arsenic from a local apothecary just days before his death. She insisted she was innocent, claiming she'd bought the poison to deal with rats in their house's basement. But the evidence against her was compelling enough that she'd fled Philadelphia just hours before a warrant was issued for her arrest. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. As a lawman, he should have been planning to turn her over to the authorities. But as a man who was growing increasingly attracted to this mysterious woman, he wanted to believe her story of innocence. The question that haunted him was whether he was falling for a murderer or helping an innocent woman escape a terrible injustice. Their third day of travel brought them into Nevada territory, but it also brought their pursuers closer. Marcus could now make out individual riders, 3 men on horseback who were clearly following their trail. When he pointed them out to Catherine, she finally revealed the complete truth about who was chasing them and why. The men following them weren't law officers from Philadelphia. They were hired guns working for Theodore Ashford's son, Robert, who was convinced that Catherine had murdered his father and was determined to see her hang for it. Robert Ashford had the money and connections to hire the best trackers and gunmen available, and he'd sworn to bring Catherine back to Philadelphia dead or alive. But Catherine had one more revelation that stopped Marcus cold. She admitted that she wasn't entirely innocent of Theodore Ashford's death, though not in the way everyone suspected. She had been slowly poisoning him, but not with arsenic. She'd been using small amounts of mercury, which she'd been slipping into his evening brandy over the course of several weeks. Her goal hadn't been to kill him, but to make him sick enough that he'd abandon the marriage arrangement and leave her family alone. The mercury poisoning had indeed been making Ashford ill, causing the tremors and confusion that his doctor had attributed to overwork and stress. But on the night he died, someone else had administered a fatal dose of arsenic, framing Catherine for a murder she hadn't committed. The real question was who had wanted Theodore Ashford dead badly enough to kill him and let Catherine take the blame. Marcus realized that Catherine's story meant there was a real murderer still free in Philadelphia, someone who had used her mercury poisoning as the perfect cover for their own crime. But it also meant that Catherine was guilty of attempted murder herself, even if she hadn't intended to kill Ashford. The moral complexity of the situation was unlike anything Marcus had faced in his years as a lawman. As they pushed their horses harder to stay ahead of their pursuers, Catherine revealed more details about the night Theodore Ashford died. She'd been at a social gathering at the Brennan house, where Ashford was discussing the final arrangements for her marriage to William Hartwell. She'd excused herself during dinner to slip mercury into Ashford's brandy, just as she'd done many times before. But when she returned to the dining room, she noticed that someone else had been near Ashford's place at the table. Her father's business associate, Charles Manning, had been standing near Ashford's chair when she returned. Manning had always opposed the marriage arrangement, claiming it was beneath both families involved. At the time, Catherine had thought nothing of Manning's presence near Ashford's place, but looking back, she realized he'd had both opportunity and motive to poison the man's food or drink. The revelation that Charles Manning might be the real murderer gave Marcus hope that Catherine's name could eventually be cleared. But first, they had to survive their current predicament. The hired guns chasing them were gaining ground, and the desert terrain offered few places to hide or make a stand. Marcus began to form a plan that would require all of his experience as a gunfighter and Catherine's courage as someone fighting for her life. They reached the town of Silver Creek, Nevada, just as the sun was setting on their fourth day of travel. It was a rough mining town, bigger than Copper Ridge but with the same frontier atmosphere of hard men making hard livings. Marcus knew the sheriff there, a man named Tom Bradley who owed him a favor from years back. But asking Bradley for help would mean revealing Catherine's situation, and Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to turn her over to the law just yet. Instead, Marcus decided on a more direct approach. He would confront Catherine's pursuers in Silver Creek, using the town as the backdrop for what might be his final gunfight. He'd faced 3-to-1 odds before and survived, though never with so much at stake personally. If he could eliminate the immediate threat, it would buy them time to reach Carson City and figure out their next move. Catherine begged him not to take such a risk on her behalf, but Marcus had made up his mind. He'd spent 5 years in Copper Ridge living a quiet life, trying to forget the violence that had once defined his younger days. But something about Catherine's situation had awakened the protective instincts he thought he'd buried along with his wife and child. He was going to make a stand, regardless of the personal cost. The confrontation came the next morning in Silver Creek's Main Street, just as the town was beginning to wake up. Marcus stepped out of the hotel where he and Catherine had spent the night, his gun hand loose and ready. The 3 hired guns had ridden into town at dawn, asking questions about a man and woman traveling together. It didn't take long for word to reach Marcus that trouble had come calling. The leader of the 3 men introduced himself as Jack Morrison, a professional gunfighter with a reputation for never failing to complete a job. Morrison explained that they had no quarrel with Marcus personally. They just wanted the woman he was traveling with. If he stepped aside, they'd take Catherine Brennan back to Philadelphia and Marcus could ride away with no hard feelings. Marcus's response was to spread his feet slightly and let his hand drift closer to his gun. He'd made his choice back in Copper Ridge when he'd agreed to escort Catherine west, and he wasn't backing down now. The 3 men spread out across the street, giving themselves room to maneuver when the shooting started. Marcus noticed that several of the townspeople had gathered to watch from safe distances, drawn by the promise of a gunfight. The shooting lasted less than 30 seconds, but those few moments contained enough violence to change several lives forever. Marcus drew first, his years of experience giving him the edge he needed against professional killers. His first shot took Morrison center mass, dropping the man before he could clear leather. His second shot caught the man on Morrison's left in the shoulder, spinning him around but not putting him down. The third gunman, positioned behind a water trough, got off 2 shots that came close enough to Marcus to burn powder marks on his shirt. But Marcus's third shot found its mark, and the man slumped forward into the dust of Silver Creek's Main Street. The wounded gunman tried to raise his weapon for another shot, but Marcus's 4th bullet ended the fight permanently. In the sudden silence that followed the gunfire, Marcus became aware of Catherine standing in the hotel doorway behind him, her face pale but her eyes fierce with determination. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, chattering excitedly about the gunfight they'd just witnessed. Sheriff Bradley appeared from his office, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of a lawman who'd seen his share of violence. Bradley listened to Marcus's explanation of the situation, though Marcus was careful not to reveal too much about Catherine's legal troubles. He presented it as a case of hired guns trying to force a woman into an unwanted marriage, which wasn't entirely untrue. Bradley seemed satisfied with the explanation, especially given his respect for Marcus's reputation as a fair and honest lawman. With the immediate threat eliminated, Marcus and Catherine resumed their journey toward Carson City. But the gunfight had changed something between them, creating a bond forged in shared danger and mutual trust. Catherine no longer seemed like a client he was escorting. She felt like a partner, someone whose fate had become intertwined with his own in ways that went beyond professional obligation. As they rode through the Nevada mountains, Catherine finally told Marcus about her real feelings regarding the arranged marriage to William Hartwell. She'd never met the man, knew him only through letters that revealed little about his character or intentions. The marriage had been arranged entirely by her father and Theodore Ashford as part of their business dealings, with Catherine's wishes never entering into consideration. But now, having experienced freedom and the companionship of a man who treated her as an equal rather than property to be traded, Catherine found herself questioning whether she wanted to go through with the marriage at all. William Hartwell might be a good man, but he was still a stranger who expected to possess her in exchange for paying her father's debts. Marcus found himself hoping that Catherine would decide to abandon the marriage arrangement, though he tried to keep his personal feelings from influencing her decision. He'd grown to care for her more than he'd thought possible in such a short time, and the idea of delivering her to another man had become increasingly painful to contemplate. On their final night before reaching Carson City, as they camped beside a mountain stream, Catherine made a decision that surprised them both. She asked Marcus to marry her instead of delivering her to William Hartwell. It wasn't a declaration of love, she explained, but a practical solution to both of their problems. She needed protection and a new identity to escape her legal troubles, while Marcus seemed like a man who could benefit from companionship and a fresh start somewhere far from both of their pasts. Marcus was tempted by the proposal, more tempted than he'd expected to be. But his sense of honor wouldn't let him take advantage of Catherine's desperate situation, no matter how much he'd come to care for her. He told her that if she wanted to marry him, it should be because she chose him freely, not because she was running from something else. He would escort her to Carson City as promised, and if she still wanted to marry him after meeting William Hartwell and considering all her options, he would be honored to accept. They reached Carson City the next afternoon, a bustling mining town that dwarfed both Copper Ridge and Silver Creek. The streets were crowded with miners, merchants, and various other characters drawn by the promise of silver wealth in the surrounding mountains. Marcus helped Catherine find the hotel where William Hartwell was expecting her, then prepared to say goodbye to the woman who had become so important to him in such a short time. But William Hartwell proved to be full of surprises himself. When Marcus and Catherine arrived at his hotel, they found not the older businessman Catherine had expected, but a man barely 30 years old with an easy smile and genuine warmth in his greeting. Hartwell explained that his letters had been deliberately vague about his personal details because he'd wanted Catherine to judge him based on their correspondence rather than preconceptions about his age or appearance. Even more surprising was Hartwell's reaction when Catherine explained her legal situation and her doubts about their arranged marriage. Rather than being angry or demanding that she honor their agreement, Hartwell seemed relieved to learn that Catherine had reservations. He admitted that he'd agreed to the marriage arrangement primarily to help his own business interests, but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of marrying a woman who had no choice in the matter. Hartwell proposed an alternative arrangement that caught both Marcus and Catherine off guard. He would provide Catherine with a new identity and enough money to start fresh somewhere else, asking only that she write to her father explaining that she'd decided not to go through with the marriage. This would free her from both her legal troubles and the unwanted marriage, while allowing Hartwell to pursue a relationship with a woman he'd met in Carson City who had genuinely captured his interest. The generous offer left Catherine speechless, but it also presented her with a choice she hadn't expected to have to make. She could accept Hartwell's help and disappear into the vast American West with a new identity and enough money to live comfortably. Or she could choose to stay with Marcus and build something real together, based on the connection they developed during their dangerous journey. Marcus waited for Catherine's decision without trying to influence her choice, though every part of him hoped she would choose to stay with him. He'd found something with Catherine that he'd thought died with his first wife, a sense of completeness and purpose that went beyond his duties as a lawman. But he also knew that she deserved the freedom to choose her own path after years of having her life controlled by others. Catherine's answer came not in words but in actions. She walked over to Marcus and took his hand, looking up into his eyes with a certainty that hadn't been there before. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't based on desperation or convenience, but on something real that had grown between them during their journey through the desert. The wedding took place 3 days later in Carson City's small church, with William Hartwell serving as witness and even paying for the celebration that followed. It was a new beginning for both Marcus and Catherine, though they knew their past would always be part of their story. Catherine would never be completely free from the suspicion surrounding Theodore Ashford's death, and Marcus would always wonder if he'd made the right choice in helping a woman who might be a murderer. But as they prepared to leave Carson City and start their new life together, neither of them regretted the decisions that had brought them to this point. They had found something worth fighting for in each other, and they were prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring as partners in every sense of the word. Their plan was to settle in California, far enough from both of their pasts to build something entirely new together. Marcus would use his experience as a lawman to find work, while Catherine could finally live under her own name and make her own choices about her future. It wouldn't be an easy life, but it would be theirs to shape according to their own desires and dreams. The story of their journey from Copper Ridge to Carson City would become legend in the small towns they'd passed through, though the details would change with each telling. Some versions would paint Catherine as an innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control, while others would suggest she was a dangerous woman who had seduced a good lawman into helping her escape justice. The truth, as always, was more complex than either version suggested. What remained constant in all versions of their story was the image of two people who had found each other in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the American West, and who had chosen to face an uncertain future together rather than apart. In a time and place where survival often depended on individual strength and self-reliance, Marcus and Catherine had discovered that some challenges could only be overcome through partnership and mutual trust. As they rode west toward California and their new life together, the sun setting behind the mountains cast long shadows across the desert landscape. But for Marcus and Catherine Whitfield, as she was now known, those shadows no longer represented something to fear but simply the natural end of one day and the promise of another beginning tomorrow. As they rode toward the California border, the desert landscape began to change around Marcus and Catherine. The harsh, unforgiving terrain of Nevada gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and wildflowers. It was as if the land itself was welcoming them to their new beginning, offering a softer, more hospitable environment for the life they were planning to build together. 3 months later, they found themselves in the small town of Harmony, California, nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges. Marcus had been offered the position of sheriff by the town council, who were impressed by his experience and the recommendations he carried from his years in Copper Ridge. Catherine had used some of William Hartwell's generous gift to open a small general store, providing the community with goods and supplies that previously required a long journey to larger towns. The townspeople of Harmony gradually came to know and respect the Whitfields, though they sensed there were stories in their past that were never fully shared. Marcus proved to be a fair and capable lawman, handling disputes and maintaining order with a wisdom that came from years of experience. Catherine's store became a gathering place for the community's women, who appreciated her intelligence and practical advice on everything from cooking to child-rearing. But even in their new life, the shadows of the past occasionally intruded. One afternoon, nearly a year after their arrival in Harmony, a stranger rode into town asking questions about a woman matching Catherine's description. Marcus met with the man privately, learning that he was a private detective hired by Robert Ashford to continue the search for Catherine Brennan. The detective, however, brought unexpected news from Philadelphia. Charles Manning, the man Catherine had suspected of being the real murderer, had died in a riding accident 6 months earlier. In settling Manning's estate, his lawyers had discovered a letter in which Manning confessed to poisoning Theodore Ashford, explaining that he'd used Catherine's mercury poisoning as cover for his own crime. The letter cleared Catherine of the murder charges, though it also revealed the extent of Manning's hatred for Ashford and his business practices. With the confession letter as evidence, the charges against Catherine were officially dropped. She was free to reclaim her real name if she chose, though she and Marcus decided that Catherine Whitfield had built a good life in Harmony and saw no reason to change it. The detective returned east with the news that Catherine Brennan had died of fever during her journey west, a story that would satisfy Robert Ashford's need for justice while protecting the new life she'd built. As the seasons turned and their first anniversary approached, Marcus and Catherine had built something solid and lasting in Harmony. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between two people fleeing their pasts, had grown into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. They'd learned to trust each other completely, sharing not just their bed and their home but their hopes and fears for the future. Catherine discovered she was carrying their first child just as winter began to settle over the valley. The news filled them both with a joy neither had expected to feel again. The promise of new life representing the ultimate symbol of their fresh start. Marcus found himself imagining teaching his son or daughter to ride, to shoot, to navigate the challenges of frontier life with courage and integrity. The baby was born in late spring. A healthy daughter they named Sarah after Marcus's first wife. With Catherine's blessing, little Sarah became the pride of Harmony, with the entire community taking an interest in her growth and development. She represented hope for the future, proof that even in the harsh realities of frontier life, love and commitment could create something beautiful and lasting. As Marcus held his daughter for the first time, looking into eyes that reminded him of Catherine's fierce determination, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The gunfight in Silver Creek, the dangerous ride through the desert, the moral complexities of Catherine's situation. All of it had led to this perfect moment of peace and happiness. Catherine, recovering from childbirth but radiant with the joy of motherhood, watched her husband cradle their child and knew that she'd made the right choice in Carson City. She could have taken William Hartwell's money and disappeared into anonymity, could have started over completely alone. Instead, she'd chosen to trust in the connection she'd felt with Marcus. And that trust had been rewarded with a love deeper than anything she'd ever imagined. The story of their dangerous journey from Arizona to Nevada had become part of Harmony's local folklore, though the details were known only to Marcus and Catherine themselves. To their neighbors, they were simply a devoted couple who'd found each other and chosen to build their lives in the growing community of the California Valley. On quiet evenings, as they sat on the porch of their modest home watching the sun set over the mountains, Marcus and Catherine would sometimes talk about the path that had brought them together. They spoke of Theodore Ashford's death, of Charles Manning's confession, of the 3 gunmen who died in Silver Creek's Main Street. These conversations helped them process the violence and moral complexity of their past while reinforcing their commitment to the peaceful life they'd built together. Their daughter Sarah grew into a spirited child who inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's sense of justice. She would grow up hearing stories of the Old West, of lawmen and outlaws, of dangerous journeys across unforgiving terrain. But she would also grow up in a home filled with love and stability, protected by parents who understood the value of the life they'd fought to create. As the years passed and Harmony grew from a small settlement into a thriving town, Marcus and Catherine aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each shared experience. They would have more children, would face new challenges and celebrate new victories, but nothing would ever match the intensity of those first days when they'd found each other in the desert and chosen to trust in something neither fully understood. The dust storms of Arizona and Nevada became distant memories, replaced by the gentle rains and warm sunshine of their California valley. The fear and uncertainty that had driven them west was replaced by the quiet confidence of people who'd found their place in the world and were determined to protect it. In the end, their story wasn't just about escape or survival or even love, though all of those elements played their parts. It was about the possibility of redemption, about the chance to start over and become better than who you'd been before. Marcus and Catherine Whitfield had seized that chance and made something beautiful from the broken pieces of their earlier lives. As the sun set on another day in Harmony, California, Marcus Whitfield adjusted his sheriff's badge and prepared to make his evening rounds, while Catherine Whitfield closed her general store and headed home to prepare dinner for their growing family. They were no longer the desperate fugitive and conflicted lawmen who'd met in Copper Ridge, Arizona. They were simply 2 people who'd found each other in the vastness of the American frontier and chosen to build something lasting together. Proof that even in the hardest of times and places, love and determination could triumph over fear and despair.